Welcome to World Chess Championship game number 4, Ding with the white pieces against Gukesh playing as black. Ding plays knight to f3, pawn to d5, pawn to e3. An interesting choice by Ding to take an offbeat approach in the opening. The idea of this e3 move is to ask a question to black. What sort of setup are they going to play? Is the bishop going to develop to f5 and g4 early? Is black going to adopt a queen's gambit declined structure with e6 and knight f6 and d5? Gukesh plays the move knight f6, keeping the position flexible, and Ding plays pawn b3. And Gukesh plays bishop to f5. I had some similar position in one of my tournament games, and my opponent, knowing that he was going to go into this setup with the white pieces, I opted for an approach that kept things very flexible with the move pawn c6, and if the bishop comes to b2, then pawn to e6, getting this triangle formation in the center. Something to be said about this opening for white is that it's not as testing on black's position if they know how to play this at least very, very solidly. From black's perspective, you might be very tempted to make moves like pawn c5 here, and I think this is exactly what white wants out of the opening. White's taking a position that they're going to play a hyper-modern approach to the opening, meaning they're controlling the center from a distance, with the pieces rather than the pawns, and then later be able to break down the center with the move d4 or c4, getting some sort of favorable structural advantage. So as black here, you have to be also aware that you're down a tempo. If we flip the board for a second, and let's imagine we have a similar position, but with reverse. White would play the starting move d4, the way black played d5. White would play the move bishop f4, where the way black played f5, and black would play the move b6, where white played pawn b3. After knight to f3, pawn to e6, it wouldn't be so common here for white to play the move pawn c4, which is kind of in the direction that I think Ding, as white, was hoping black would go into. So Ding has the white pieces, but he's almost like playing black up at 2 tempos. So imagine if it was black's turn again in this position. They could easily equalize with moves like d5, c5, or some kind of bishop e4 check. And from white's perspective, you don't really want to commit pawn to c4 when black has the option of having 2 tempi in this position, playing a move d5 or c5, equalizing the position. But we have things in reverse into our game, where Ding is opting for this structure with the white pieces up a tempo. So I think he is really hoping with the move bishop e2 that Gukesh falls into some opening trap, heading for trying to get the center control, trying to say to white, if you're going to play a bit passively, I'm going to take over the center. But then again, he might reach a position that will have an unfavorable structure. So for example, in the game, h6 was played, but if you play a move like pawn c5 and bishop e2, knight c6, and d4, you potentially run into the problem of not getting a favorable structure with black and getting quite a nice structure with white. The pawn on d4 and c5 are going to be traded at some point, and the bishop's scope will open up along this diagonal. So a move like e6, castles, bishop e7, not the ideal move here, but just for example, takes. White has a very natural play along this diagonal with moves like c4 coming and knight to c3. And I think black is fine here as well. But it's going into a direction that Ding is hoping to play for some favorable structure against Gukesh. In the game, we have h6, and Ding plays the move bishop to a3. This is also very provocative. It's saying to black, how are you going to develop the bishop on f8? If you play pawn to e6, I will take, and you can no longer castle. So Gukesh plays knight e7, and after castles, you have a choice. You can play pawn c5, and although I don't like this move as black, it attempts to combat white's attempt to get some opening advantage, and black may be able to take over the position, and black would be fighting with the initiative with this move. The problem with pawn c5, and I think it's a fine move here, is that you can play the move pawn d4 and still have this potential of opening up the bishop on this diagonal. So the question is, what do you do against this bishop move? And the other option is to allow the trade of dark squared bishops and take back with the knight on f8. If the knight takes back, the knight is slightly misplaced and will need an extra tempo to get back into the game. So I think it's a really interesting choice by Ding to go into this kind of style of opening where you're asking some long-term strategic or even short-term strategic questions by Gukesh, how to find the proper organization for his pieces and pawns. We have pawn to e6, bishop takes, knight takes, and pawn to c4. Knight to d7. I think at this point it was also interesting for Gukesh to play the move pawn c6. And the point of this move pawn c6 is that in the case white decides to take on d5, black can take back with the c pawn, keeping the position balanced in terms of the pawn structure. In this case, ideally, pawn takes on d5 would be similar to what happened in the game. So this definitely was an option to play the move pawn c6 here and get some sort of symmetrical pawn structure. Okay, Gukesh plays knight d7. We have knight to c3 again. Okay, now that the knight's on d7, maybe instead of playing for c6, we can play for c5 in one move later on. Black castles, and we have captures, captures, and pawn b4. So this trade is a significant change of structure, and we see a similar structure that we had in a previous game, which was in game number 3, where Gukesh had the white pieces. We have a pawn majority on the king side and center for white, and a pawn majority 4 versus 2 for black on the queen side. So the plans are for white to create this minority attack with their use of 2 pawns to create a potential weakness on the queen side. From white's perspective, white could also consider the move pawn d3, and I don't think it's easily playable in this position, but they could try for some majority attack using their 5 pawns to block for 3 on the king side. Okay, so the question is, what are black's plans in this position? Do they simply react to white's moves, or can they come up with their own possible plans as well? Well, I think with the black pieces, Gukesh is aiming for something where he can completely equalize the position, and once that's achieved, fight for some edge. And it might not be easy for black to play for the move c5 or trying to, let's say, activate his pawn majority here without creating some serious weaknesses of his own. Okay, in the game, we have the move pawn to b4, pawn to c6, and knight to d4. The bishop goes to h7, queen to b3, preparing some ideas like pawn b5, and the queen puts pressure on the d5 pawn. So if you take on b5, we don't have to take back on b5, we can take on the d5 square. After knight to e5, we have pawn to a4. Careful not to move the rook to the b1 square. It may be assisting you in trying to advance these pawns, but the bishop is scoping down this entire diagonal. So I think at this point in the game, Gukesh has done an excellent job with the black pieces, getting a very solid position, and now needs to be able to combat white's threat of pawn b5 and creating a weakness on the c6 square. Gukesh plays rook to c8, and I think this was an interesting concrete approach in order to be able to meet this move pawn b5 with the move pawn c5 in this position. Maybe black could play pawn c5 anyways, but the way Gukesh played was very, let's say, interesting. It did allow Ding to get some play, as we'll see in a moment. Okay, so a5 is played. a5, attempts to continue to grab space on the queen side and possibly play the move a6, undermining the pawn on c6. In addition to that, just grabbing space on the queen side and asking black a question: how are they going to um, deal with this a6 coming, or even just the pawn on b7 in general? Okay, so Gukesh decides to play concretely here and plays the move pawn to b6. And Ding has an opportunity to take advantage of this move, which he failed to find in the game. And this was his critical moment to play the move um, bishop to a6. If it was either this move or the next move afterwards, um, bishop to a6. So there is a difference in this position, and should be noted. There's some small detail here, which is that if you play the move b6, and white plays the move pawn to f4, kicking away the knight. After the move knight to d7, or sorry, knight to c4, takes, queen takes, pawn c5. Once the knight moves, the knight will access for black this queen's control over the d3 square, and black will have this fork. So for example, the knight moves, or you take first, or the knight moves, and black simply has this move bishop to d3. Okay, but in this position, if white inserts this move bishop to a6, forcing the rook to a vulnerable square like c7, then after f4, knight c4, takes, and pawn c5. Again, if the knight moves, then the bishop can come to d3, hitting the queen and the rook. But now white has this move, knight to b5. And with the knight on b5, the knight is able to attack the rook on c7, winning one crucial tempo. I actually think it's the other way around. Is it this knight to b5 or the other knight? Um, yeah, this knight on d4 is actually a blunder because of bishop d3 again, but the other knight. And the idea is that the queen is still not able to guard the d3 square. Okay, so in the game, after knight pawn b6, Ding really had this opportunity to insert this move bishop to a6, forcing the rook to c7, or take a passive role with rook b8. And rook b8 is not even playable because after f4, the knight gets kicked away, and then the pawn on c6 drops. Ding plays the move knight to f3, and he takes about 12 minutes with this move. It's a very unfortunate move that he had to play to I don't know what he was aiming for in this case with knight f3, but it failed to get an advantage with the white pieces. So his opening was a success. He reached a position that was strategically very favorable for white. You had the only option to create pawn breaks on the queen side with a5. Okay, b5 was a critical one, and black trying to solve the problems concretely could have run into some trouble, and Ding couldn't take advantage of it. After captures, pawn d4, knight to e2, takes, bishop to e4. Gukesh is going for maximum amount of trades. Queen to e7, takes, and Ding plays knight to c3. This is not going to win with the white pieces. After rook d8, takes. A lot of trades happened, and the game fizzled out to a draw. Okay, so maybe Gukesh played a move f5, even trying to play for some win. Maybe he wants to play queen e4 and trade off the queens and get a favorable structure with the outside pass pawn, but also kind of risky as well. And the game just petered out to a draw after this repetition. So game 4 concludes with a draw. Gukesh very solid with the black pieces. I think Ding was doing a great job in the opening, getting some very interesting strategic position, but at a critical moment failed to play concretely in a way that would give black some difficulties. Let's see what happens in tomorrow's game. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video, and I look forward to the recap tomorrow.